retired about 8 months ago from the United States Army, where I had been basically on active duty off and on for over 22 years. I had a long military career that included some time in the reserves, but I kept getting mobilized after 9/11, so I ended up doing a very long stretch that took over basically the past 5 years. And as part of my very last assignment, I was assigned to Washington, D.C. at the Office of Military Commissions, where I served as a defense counsel. And it's a very unusual job. They basically only accept volunteers from the Reserve Corps. There are some active duty people who just get sent there. That's their assignment. You know, they kind of don't have much choice. But usually those people get sent to the prosecution side, or they get asked what they would prefer. The vast majority of people on the defense side are volunteers. As you can imagine, it's not a very popular job. In fact, I was told point blank by several of my military colleagues that it was basically a career ender. You know, don't ever hope to get promoted again. You know, there's not going to be, you know, a lot of people are going to look askance at this, let's say, because we're really, you know, as they used to say, we were defending the worst of the worst, and a lot of people couldn't understand how we could even accept such a role. Well, I knew because of previous exposure to people who were working on the commissions and who up in Washington, and because I had a lifelong interest in Islamic law and a variety of other topics that kind of dovetailed into this, I knew quite a bit about the commissions before I went there, which is why I volunteered. I was actually offered a chance to go there kind of unexpectedly back right after President Obama got elected. At that time, there was a big belief and hope that Guantanamo would be closed down, and they were ramping up a lot of personnel to try to move some of the cases, or so we thought. So I got kind of a short notice opportunity, went up there fully expecting that, you know, within a year or so, they would actually be closing Guantanamo, or at least substantially reducing the population. After all, that's what kind of one of the things that Obama ran on, right? Well, once I got up there, and it was kind of a holding pattern while they were trying to figure out what to do, and Congress was weighing in, and there were all these things going on. As you know, Guantanamo has not closed. Mercifully, there have been no additions to Guantanamo in over almost 5 years. Although, as we also know, there's been talk by certain people about sending a few new people down there. Thank God, I will say, they didn't send anybody else down there, and they're not going to be sending the young man up in Boston down there. And there's a variety of reasons why I say that. The first reason is because, as a U.S. citizen, he should certainly be entitled to all of the protection and justice that our system, the Guantanamo Commission system, has been notoriously inept at prosecuting anyone. Out of 800 inmates that have spent time down there, the large majority of them have been released. Released because they didn't have anything to do with terrorism and should have never been sent there in the first place. Out of all the inmates that have ever been in Guantanamo, probably as many as you can count on one hand have ever been tried or perhaps will be tried. 4 or 5 people have been tried and their sentences have been executed since Guantanamo opened. 4 people. There are another 6 trials ongoing at this time. The so-called 9/11-5 and the Cole bomb. Those 6 trials are ongoing. Due to a variety of snafus, they probably are not going to move forward as quickly as everyone had hoped. There are a lot of problems with the current prosecution, and there are a lot of problems with the previous prosecutions because pretty much most of them have been overturned on appeal to a large extent. And oh, by the way, they were all guilty pleas. So basically, no one has been tried that didn't plead guilty, and no one who has been tried and found guilty has had their sentence upheld by the appellate court. So the commission system is a notoriously inefficient, inept, and I would go so far as to say unjust. But I'm not going to get too in-depth in that. I could certainly talk about that for hours on end. I would like to talk more about my specific experience and knowledge about the solitary confinement down in Guantanamo. And it's particularly important now because, as you are probably also aware, I probably expect y'all are tuned into what's been going on there lately. The hunger strike that commenced down in Guantanamo several months ago has resulted in nearly half the population placed into solitary confinement. Now, to the average American citizen, I will say, who could care less, they probably think that's where they belong in the first place. Why were they running free? Why should they have a country club prison down in Club Med of Cuba? But I would like to remind everyone that over half the people who remain in Guantanamo today have already been cleared for release. Out of about 166 people, 86 of those people have already been cleared for release and repatriation. That means they've already been subjected to a panel of military people down there who reviewed their case and determined they either had no connection to terrorism, no connection to 9/11, they were caught improperly, or there's just no evidence at all to support why they're there. Now, let me remind you why most of them wound up here. They wound up here because right after 9/11, the U.S. government put the word out on the street, the Arab street, that they were paying a bounty of $5,000 a head for anybody affiliated with Al-Qaeda, terrorism, anybody who'd ever spoken a negative word about the United States. So, round up the usual suspects. They took a huge, large swath of people in their net at that time. Not because they had actually done anything, but because maybe somebody had a grudge against them, or their father-in-law didn't like them and wanted to get rid of them, or they had been previously wronged by someone, or they were just a stranger. I mean, think about it. $5,000 in that part of the world, in Afghanistan, or Pakistan. That could be like almost a life savings for some of us. I mean, $5,000 could have been like $1 million. So if you could turn in a stranger that you didn't even know, some little strange person maybe who was hanging around your neighborhood or annoying your wife or your daughter, you would do it. Not thinking that in the long run the person would stay there, probably thinking, oh, well, I'll get the money, they'll take him away, they'll release him in a few months, no harm, no foul, and we'll be done with it. And a lot of it was to exploit the U.S. Well, as I mentioned, over 800 people originally spent time in Guantanamo. We're now down to a population of 166. So right here you can see 635 people have already been released who should have never been there. And out of the remaining 166, half of them should be released. And then out of the half that remain, the government has already determined, well, we really can't charge about 45 of these folks, but they're too dangerous to release because they've been radicalized, and we can't run the risk of letting them go back. Well, so you keep narrowing it down. I represented a client who got swept up in 9/11 back in March 2002. He was caught in a safe house. That's what they call it. I prefer to call it a boarding house. There was a big sweep of a town called Faisalabad, Pakistan. And my client, his name is Guanta-No-More, was caught up with a bunch of other people in that house, over 2/3 of whom were subsequently released. But because my client happens to be an educated and articulate man who spoke fluent English, who had actually lived in the United States, and who had the unfortunate pedigree of being in Saudi Arabia. 15 of the hijackers were supposedly Saudi Arabian. He was taken into custody and held for an extensive period of time and promised certain things, and the U.S. government attempted to flip him. They wanted him to be a source. They wanted him to give them information. In fact, it's my belief, based on my reading of certain statements and documents and reports, that they were actually trying to use him to see if they could kind of get him to help them out. Now, maybe they would have released him if he had been willing, or if he had some useful intelligence, but he didn't have it. Because he really, in my personal view, had no involvement. He was caught up at the wrong time in the wrong place. Now, how he ended up in that particular house, I can only speculate. I don't want to get into all that. But after only a few short months of repeated interrogation, where they were kind of playing the good cop, bad cop with him, they decided they weren't getting anywhere. So they took away one interrogator and brought in another one who took a much harder line. And who basically decided that my client was a piece of crap, was lying, couldn't be believed about anything, had more useful intelligence, and they decided to turn the screws up on it. Well, my client, like a lot of the clients, a lot of the detainees who were caught up at the very beginning, some of them told what they knew. Some of them made up stories. Some of them actually elaborated and embroidered their stories to make themselves look more involved or more important. Why? Because the government told them, if you help us, we'll help you. Now, the bottom line was, after several months, and then kind of when they really started turning up the screws, we know about waterboarding and sleep deprivation booth grave and positions, frequent flyer. I don't know if you don't even know what that is. That means they move you from cell to cell every 3 hours. They wake you up in the middle of the night. They move you to another cell just to disrupt your sleep pattern. Well, my client was involved in all of that. He had a lot of pressure put on him, and he basically clammed up and would not cooperate at all. Now, because he had previously been cooperative, and because now he wasn't helping them at all, they really started punishing him. And he was first put in solitary confinement. This is 10 years ago. Over the years, basically nothing happened on his case. I can't understand myself how he kind of fell off the planet, fell out of the universe. But by the time he finally got a court hearing, based on what I have observed, he didn't get a court hearing, he got a habeas hearing. I don't know if you know what habeas corpus is. It was a brief time, and they were actually going into federal court and allowing some of the detainees to challenge their incarceration. And several of them were released on the habeas theory, that they shouldn't have been there in the first place and they'd already been cleared for release. That was about 5 or 6 years ago. Well, all the habeas action came to a grinding halt. My client decided that he didn't want anybody to represent him that had anything to do with the U.S. government. He didn't want a U.S. attorney. He didn't want a military attorney. And there was a big stink about whether or not he was going to be required to have counsel, whether he was competent to represent himself or not. And the judge actually ruled that, well, he's competent, meaning he's not out of his mind, but he's not competent to represent himself. So he put all the proceedings on hold. My client fired his 2 attorneys. He was appointed new attorney, and that went on for about 3 or 4 years till I became involved in his case. As far as I can see, none of his court-appointed attorneys did anything for him. Now, there wasn't much to be done because he stopped communicating with them entirely during that time. 5 years, nobody heard from the guy. Why didn't he write his attorneys back? Why didn't he at least accept visits? Well, my contention and sincere belief is because he's been driven mad. Now, why do I think he was driven mad? Well, very interesting, because I went to London about this time last year to meet with some members of my client's family. And it was at this time that I learned that he'd actually been seeing a psychiatrist, and he'd been on some antidepressant medications, 2 different medications, for some long period of time before he was captured. Now, I know how things are in Guantanamo, and I do not believe he has been getting psychiatric care, and I do not believe he's been getting his medication. And certainly, the fact that he needed it before he ever went in, and the fact that he's been subjected to torture, isolation, deprivation, he's been on repeated hunger strikes himself. I actually have good cause to believe that he's one of the longest hunger strikers in Guantanamo. I read something just the other day, an article written by Carol Rosenberg of the Miami Herald, who's written extensively about Guantanamo. Someone asked her, well, what about this current hunger strike? How long have these people been on strike? Well, the big strike started about 2 months ago. I think we're all aware of that. But before that, you had individuals who have been striking. And I know my client's been striking since about 2005. It's very funny because it took a long time for me to figure out what was actually going on with him. I was writing letters. I was going down to Guantanamo. I had appointments to go see him. He would never see me. I would go and talk to the prosecutor and find out, what's going on with my client. Oh, he's in the hospital today. He's in the hospital. Well, what's wrong with him? Well, we can't tell you. Why can't you tell me? It's classified. Okay? Well, fine. I would go home, or I'd go back to my office, go back to Washington. 6 weeks later, go back to Guantanamo. I'm here to see my client. Well, he doesn't want to see anyone today. He can't see anyone today. Why is that? Well, he's taking some medication. Started ushering me through, and before I knew it, after about 2 or 3 stops and starts, I was actually taken to the cell block where my client was. And I was extremely surprised. It happened kind of quickly. I couldn't have found my way there by myself if my life depended on it, but what ended up happening was, whether they were legitimately confused or they thought I was allowed to be there, it turned out it was a huge mistake, and a lot of people's heads rolled over it. A lot of people got in trouble. I got accused of lying or manipulating my way in or bullying my way in, or, there was a big stink, and I was barred from visiting my client for 2 months. Didn't matter, he wasn't going to see me anyway. But the point is, I got taken into the cell block
where I observed the conditions in which he was living. I was actually taken to the wrong cell initially. So I walk in, there's a little bank of cells, about 5-6 foot wide cells. It's a very dark, horribly depressing place, very stark, very gloomy and grungy kind of. I was always told, you can't describe it, you can't discuss it, but there are pictures. You can look it up on the internet. You can see a picture of the cell blocks. I don't see that there's any problem. I was never told not to discuss it. I was never told actually what I saw was top secret or classified, so I'm just going to give you the briefest of details. Bottom line was I was taken to the wrong cell, and I started talking through the cell. It was a big wall with a little, like a little tray that slides in and out where they slide their meals out, and some bars at the top and some screen at the bottom. And one of the little guards actually was trying to help me out because I was tiptoeing, kind of looking through the bars, trying to talk, and kind of talking under the screen. He brought me a chair. So here I am sitting in a chair, kind of talking through the screen at the fellow behind the thing. And I was there for about 2 minutes telling him, I'm so glad I finally get to come in and talk to you. And I don't know, what we're going to do, but we've got to get you out of here. I just want to tell you I've talked to your family. Well, before I could even almost say that much, the little guard comes scurrying down the hall. Oh, man, that's the wrong prisoner. Sorry, your guy's over here. Well, I stood up from my chair, and I looked up, and there's a guy looking out at me just like, that picture of the screen? That horrible picture? That's what it looked like. And I just looked at him and I said, I'm sorry to disturb you. I don't want to bother you. Excuse me, I'm in the wrong place. I moved 2 doors down and I look in and I see my client covered with a blanket lying on his slab. And the guard says, your attorney's here? And all I saw was like a little feeble hand waving. So I sat down and I started again and commenced a discussion or a conversation. He never said a word. He appeared catatonic or comatose or the only reason I know he wasn't sleeping is because of that little feeble little wave. But I later learned he was probably drugged. But I didn't have much time with him because, again, another one of the guards came scurrying in saying, oh, ma'am, didn't they tell you your client doesn't want to see anyone today? No, but it's pretty obvious. Sorry to bother. Gassan, I'll be back tomorrow. Please, come see me. Come see me in the meeting area. I will return tomorrow. God bless you. I love you. Keep the faith. I'll see you tomorrow. And those are my last words to him. And I walked out. And then no sooner did I get in my car, I drove away. I had to go back out. And I came out of the prison compound, and I pulled over, and I basically burst into tears because it was so traumatic. And I started writing a memorandum about what had happened so I wouldn't forget it. And I reviewed it before I came today. Well, like I said, we all got in big trouble for that. Some of the guards got relieved. I got a letter of admonition from the prison camp warden. I even got in trouble with my own office because they were confused about how I could have made such a mistake. And that's when I realized that the entire Guantanamo Commission's system was a farce. There was no real objective to help the prisoners there. What the President seems to want, what Congress seems to want, and what most Americans have complied with is they just want to forget about it. Just forget about it. Pretend it's not there. In fact, if I must be sincere, I find that this propaganda that we just viewed as a film, I'm somewhat offended because clearly the film was made in the last year or so. Why didn't they interview some of the prisoners from Guantanamo who've been released, who spent time in solitary, who lost eyes or limbs, or who've been driven half mad, who have permanent post-traumatic stress syndrome? There's about 800 people who've spent time there. 650 of them are free now. Several of them have founded organizations in London. One's called Caged Prisoner, ironically. They could have been interviewed for this film. They didn't even mention Guantanamo. Rather strange, I feel. I don't understand that. Except that because I happen to be very informed about these issues, I'm also quite very well aware that there's a move away from incarcerating prisoners in solitary because they need to be out there doing something useful. They need to be out there earning their keep, contributing to society. So what does that mean? Prison labor, that's what it means. They're trying to reform our prison system. So all those warm bodies can be switched over to be doing cheap labor, at a dime an hour or whatever they pay prisoners. Now, I could get off on a real tangent about our confinement system in the United States in general. I have to say, several years ago, I read this book before I went to Guantanamo. It's called Justice That Restores by Charles Colson. You may remember Charles Colson. He founded the International Prison Fellowship. He was also a convicted Watergate participant. And this book really opened my eyes to what's really wrong with the U.S. justice system. Anyone who's interested in this area, it's a very short little book. It's a really quick read. I urge you to look it over. Because the contention of this book is we've gotten far, far afield from what the justice system really should be doing with prisoners. First of all, we've got too many people in prison. I think we can all agree with that. Second of all, our system is slowly transmogrifying from a system that once used to try to, as the film did state accurately, help people rehabilitate. More and more now, it's just punishment. And that's what solitary confinement is, punishment. It does not help the individual find his way back to his place in society. It does not help the justice system get rid of these people instead of keeping them in for years on end. You can't imagine how much it costs to incarcerate people in prisons these days. How much does it cost to incarcerate a Guantanamo detainee? Does anybody have a ballpark clue or a guess? One detainee for 1 year costs $800,000. Now, how much does it cost to go to Harvard for a year? Okay? How much do we make a year? Anybody here make $800,000 a year? Maybe 10 of us together. And that's just the cost of running the prison facility with the guards and the gates and the meals and the wires and the transport to and from Guantanamo. That probably doesn't even include the hidden cost of having a staff of 100 attorneys up in Washington, D.C., a lot of them receiving temporary duty pay, judges, civilian attorney volunteers. But the cost is much greater than just the financial cost. It's a cost to society and to our humanity. Down in Guantanamo, it's a very strange thing. All the guards, all the people that work there, they don't have name tags, they have numbers. And they refer to the detainees by their numbers. My client's number is 682, okay? If you refer to 682, everybody knows who you're talking about. Shaker Amer, the guy I think I might have accidentally spoken to when I was down there originally, the one that looks like the screen, he's been there 11 years. He's a British citizen and can't get out. He's already been, they've approved that they'll release him to Saudi Arabia, but he doesn't want to go to Saudi Arabia. He wants to go home to Great Britain, where he's a citizen. For whatever reason, there's a big political brouhaha. Of course, the United States government and Great Britain collaborate on quite a few things. But the bottom line is this. The real cost of all of the prisoners in Guantanamo, and I would contend the prisoners in the U.S. justice system who are in solitary confinement, who are slowly being driven mad, who are losing their humanity, who will never be able to be rehabilitated or repatriated, as it were, back to their home countries. The real cost is to society, because people who are driven mad are a drain on society. The prisoners in Guantanamo who are in solitary, should I say all the prisoners in Guantanamo who are held wrongfully and have no business being there. The strange argument that the leaders make, the congressional hardliners make is, well, we can't let them go. They might go back to the fight. But wait, we've already determined they weren't in the fight in the first place. So why are we saying they might go back to the fight? And oh, by the way, what about all their friends, brothers, sisters, mother, father, family members, neighbors, who know their sons have been held wrongfully for 11 years? Aren't we more worried about them joining the fight than about these broken men going back to the fight? I would just simply like to conclude by asking you, when you're thinking about solitary confinement, remember the Gulag 90 miles south of the United States mainland, which is Guanta-No-More. That's the real problem we've got in this country. All of the other solitary confinements are pretty much just kind of exemplary, they're representative of the real festering cancer that's down in Guantanamo.